Beginning in 1929, the world economy found itself in a state of profound crisis that would alter the fate of millions across the globe. Germany felt the most catastrophic consequences of this collapse. The country, which had already endured the horrors of the First World War with millions killed and wounded, and the burden of staggering reparations that it was obligated to pay to the victors, suddenly found itself on the edge of an abyss. Millions of unemployed wandered the streets of major cities, factories stood empty and silent, and the trauma of hyperinflation in 1923, when money lost its value at a bewildering pace, remained fresh in the collective memory of every resident. The streets of Berlin, Munich, and the Ruhr region were filled with people in degraded circumstances, many living in shanty towns and soup kitchens. Social tensions mounted daily, and fear about the future gripped nearly every person. Young people had no hope of employment, families were disintegrating, and crime was rising dramatically. Then, when virtually everyone believed the situation hopeless, and democratic institutions faced increasingly harsh criticism, when extremist parties were calculating their growing numbers of supporters, one regime offered solutions which, despite their deep moral bankruptcy and despotic nature, genuinely transformed the country's economic landscape in record time. This was the economic miracle that astonished economists of the era, prompted journalists to write articles about the incredible revival, and caused democratic politicians across European countries to worry and tremble with anxiety, understanding that their own nations had no such economic solution to the crisis. To understand how this came to pass, we must return to the moment when a new player appeared on the political stage. In 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, and from that moment the country's economic policy began to change radically. Yet it is important to understand that this was not an ascent into the unknown, not a revolution without planning. Economists and specialists of the time had certain plans and proposals that were prepared earlier, even during the Weimar Republic era. The central figure in this process was Hjalmar Schacht, a brilliant financier of Dutch origin who developed a revolutionary system of economic management adapted to the realities of the new regime. Schacht was a man of exceptional intellect, already renowned in financial circles as the architect who had successfully resolved the hyperinflation crisis of 1923 through the introduction of a new currency, the Rentenmark, which was quite a genius move precisely because it was not a traditional gold-backed currency, but rather a currency backed by land and industrial asset. His experience demonstrated that a monetary system is constructed more on confidence and the assurance of investors and businesses than on material reserves. Now, in 1933, he had the opportunity to apply his ideas and develop even more revolutionary mechanisms on an even grander scale. Schacht became president of the Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, and in this position he obtained virtually unlimited power over the country's economy, essentially unlimited authority to implement economic policy. Unlike traditional central bankers, who were typically conservative in their methods and adhered to international financial norms, Schacht was willing to experiment and take risks to achieve stated objectives, willing to violate traditional rules of the game. The first step was understanding that traditional economics, built on market mechanisms, could not deliver positive results under extraordinary circumstances and deep depression. The new system aimed at total central control of the economy, directing resources to where they were most needed for national recovery. The state began actively intervening in economic affairs, managing not only major corporations but also regulating even minor aspects of economic life. Private enterprises formally remained private, but in practice they functioned according to state plans, receiving orders from the government and adhering to its directives regarding production, prices, and resource distribution. The government established price corridors, controlled access to raw materials, and determined how corporate profits would be distributed, how much would go to reinvestment, and how much to dividends. Owners of major factories were often transformed into managers of state projects, receiving fixed salaries and required to execute directives from Berlin without question or resistance. One of the most revolutionary measures was that the state directly undertook massive public works projects on an unprecedented scale. Government officials understood that under conditions of mass unemployment, new jobs had to be created as quickly as possible, not through traditional market mechanisms, which would be far too slow, but through direct state initiative. Throughout the country, construction projects of grandiose proportions commenced. Streets were widened, new roads appeared where none had existed before, bridges were constructed, railways expanded, public buildings erected, hydroelectric stations developed, and entire infrastructure complexes were built that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. The project to construct a network of motor highways, named the Autobahn, became the symbol of this great endeavor. The initial sections were designed to be among the widest roads in the world of that era, with ingenious engineering that allowed them to traverse various terrains and waterways while incorporating aesthetic considerations and monumental design. Thousands of workers gained employment, received monthly wages which they had not possessed for years, hot meals, work, clothing, and purpose which they had lost. Workers were provided with hot lunches, work uniforms, and tools, and were organised into groups and teams. Within a few years, unemployment fell from catastrophically high levels to near zero, which was indeed a remarkable achievement compared to other nations still suffering from persistent joblessness. Yet here lies something fascinating, and this is often omitted from historical narratives. The state did not possess real money to finance these massive projects. It could not turn to international capital markets, since the country owed substantial sums for reparations and its credit rating was low, essentially non-functional. Therefore, Schacht devised a system revolutionary precisely in its financial creativity, and which is still cited by contemporary economists as an example of unconventional thinking and financial creativity. The state issued bills and bonds not in traditional currency backed by gold, but in special documents named Mefo bills, from the name of a fictitious company, Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, which could be redeemed through future taxes or bartered goods and raw materials. These instruments circulated through the economy like money, maintained regular circulation as conventional currency, but they were not backed by actual gold or foreign exchange. Creditors who accepted these bills did so with the understanding that they would receive value in the form of goods or services in the future. In essence, the state was creating value from nothing, yet it did so artfully and with such confidence that the economy accepted this monetary system as genuine value. This was a scheme that would have been impossible to implement without absolute state control over the economy and without psychological confidence that the system would have long-term existence. Banks and investors had to believe in this system for it to function. Immense significance lay also in the fact that the economy was completely directed towards specific, clearly defined priorities. Rather than dispersing resources across all sectors, the authorities concentrated them in particular directions. Production of luxury items, which people desired for comfort and satisfaction, was almost entirely halted. Resources that previously went to consumer goods production were now directed to heavy industry, steel production, oil extraction, chemical manufacturing, and most importantly, armaments. This reorientation was possible precisely because the state exercised absolute control over the economy and could compel people and business structures to perform whatever was demanded of them without possibility of discussion or resistance. The state also developed an intricate system of foreign currency control, which was critically important because the nation required access to raw materials and energy resources. Under conditions of currency shortages, the country required a strategic and often harsh approach to international trade. Germany began actively trading with Balkan countries, South American nations, and Southern European states, offering industrial goods in exchange for raw materials and foodstuffs necessary to sustain the economy. Often this was barter trade. I give you industrial goods, you give me raw materials. It was far less advantageous than traditional world market commerce, but it provided access to necessary resources and allowed the country to avoid expenditure of foreign currency. The true fascination lies in how the state managed labour resources and workforce. Rather than allowing the free market to determine wages and working conditions, the state established strict, rigid rules. Labour unions were either dissolved or transformed into organisations that were essentially extensions of state power. Workers received state-determined wages, but possessed no right to demand more or change employment on their own initiative. This sounds cruel, and it genuinely was cruel, but from the perspective of economic efficiency, it provided stability, predictability of labour costs for production planning, and allowed avoidance of competition for workers and wage inflation. One of the most intriguing aspects of this process was its psychological dimension and the role of propaganda. People who had been unemployed for years and deeply discouraged, who had lost even hope for the future, suddenly gained employment, stable wages, and a sense of purpose and direction. Propaganda did its work well, convincing people they were participating in a great national mission to restore their country's greatness. The state organised massive celebrations, demonstrations, and festivals intended to display national unity and strength. People wore uniforms of various organisations that presented themselves as part of a grand historic movement. All these spectacles created the impression that the country was truly developing and progressing, that people were part of a historic process. The statistics of the era were truly staggering. At the beginning of the 1930, unemployment in Germany was abominably high, often cited as approximately 6 million people, or roughly 1/3 of the workforce. Within a few years, this figure had been reduced to less than 1 million, though it should be noted that some of these people were conscripted into military service or organisations that were formally civilian but functionally military in nature. Industrial production grew by enormous percentages, doubling and tripling in short periods. Everywhere new schools appeared, hospitals, office buildings. Germany seemed to live in a world of construction and renewal. Railways were expanded and modernised. The streets of major cities were replanned and widened. To many observers, including some favourably disposed foreign economists, this appeared as an economic miracle. Yet one must understand that this economic revival was constructed on highly unconventional and even fantastic foundation. First and foremost, the vast sums expended on public works often lacked rational economic justification from the perspective of long-term profitability. Some projects were initiated that made no economic sense for profitability or long-term value. They were undertaken because the state needed to stimulate the economy, provide people with work, and create an impression of progress. Some newly constructed highways sometimes led nowhere, or in directions where they were not practically needed. Most significantly, however, a substantial portion of the economic growth was actually directed toward preparation for war. Although this was not publicly acknowledged in official statements, the realities were apparent to economists and observers. Railways were expanded because they would be needed for military material transport and troop movement. The chemical industry was developed because it was required for explosives and other military needs. Steel production increased not because it was needed for civilian construction, but because it formed the foundation of armaments and military production. Much of production and investment was directed toward developing the aviation industry, which demanded advanced technology and massive capital investments. The state also continuously expanded the military, which naturally served as an economic driver. Weapons production, manufacture of military uniforms, army provisioning, and development of military industry all created jobs and spurred growth in other sectors. This was an autocatalytic process. The larger the military, the more weapons required, which created more jobs, which created more managed demand, which spurred more production. But this was an economy disconnected from genuine civilian needs. The real problem lay in the fact that such an economy could not be sustained without constant expansion and, ultimately, without external conquest and territorial seizure. Officials of the time understood this dilemma, although they did not always express it openly. The economy could not develop indefinitely based solely on internal resources and artificially created demand. The system was constructed in a manner that required it to constantly move forward or collapse. It resembled a pyramid that sustained itself through constant infusions of new resources and perpetual expansion. One economist noted quite cynically in his memoirs that the system was built on the assumption that it would expand outward into the world or simply implode. Integral to this systemic approach was an ideology that legitimized all these economic manipulations. People were told they were participating in a great historical event, that they were part of a magnificent nation destined to assume its rightful place in the world. Young people were educated with the understanding that their duty was to serve this grand purpose. The entire system of education, culture, and media was concentrated on reinforcing this ideology. This made people more willing to accept restrictions on freedom, shortages of consumer goods, and mobilization for economic objectives deemed national priorities. Yet, here is what is often omitted from accounts of this economic miracle. To what degree was it genuinely a miracle? And to what degree was it a house of cards with enormous internal contradictions? By 1936 to 1937, signs began appearing that the economy was overheating. Foreign currency deficits became more acute. Reserves of resources previously accumulated began depleting. Inflation, though suppressed by rigid price controls, was in fact rising in disguised form. People desired to purchase goods, but they were either unavailable or distributed under strict rationing systems. Understanding these difficulties, leadership made the decision to accelerate rearmament and prepare for military expansion. This was not, as had been previously claimed, an economy developing for peaceful purposes. Everything was reoriented toward war. People were mobilized. Production was fundamentally redirected to military needs. All other objectives were relegated to secondary importance. In a certain sense, this was an escape from the dilemma in which the system found itself. The economy could not be sustained on a peaceful basis without enormous economic ruptures and contradiction. The prospect of global war became for such an economy not truly an aim, but rather a necessity. What then was this economic miracle? It was a combination of several factors. First, it was genuinely innovative application of state power to direct an economy. Prior to this time, economists typically believed that solutions to economic problems lay in free markets, or, in some cases, mild state regulation. This system demonstrated that a state, if it possessed sufficient power and control, could deploy the economy to achieve specific objectives. Second, it was a miracle of prioritization. Rather than dispersing resources across a broad spectrum, the state concentrated them in specific sectors that had cascading effects throughout the economy. Third, it was a miracle of psychology and propaganda. People who had been disappointed and demoralized were convinced that they were participating in a magnificent project, and this sustained their motivation and spurred them to labor despite harsh conditions. Yet this was also a miracle built upon sand. It was based on fixation, on artificially created demand, on resources that could not expand infinitely. It was based on rigid political control that prevented normal economic mechanisms from functioning. It was based on the assumption that the system had to constantly expand or collapse. This was not an example of healthy, sustainable economics that could exist long term. This was an example of how a state could deploy its power to achieve short-term results by mortgaging the future and drawing society into dynamics that had to culminate in military expansion and ultimately in the seizure of foreign resources to keep the system operating. Contemporary economists examining this period often hold mixed feelings. On one hand, one must acknowledge the innovativeness of certain methods, the effectiveness of state planning in achieving specific objectives, and even how the system managed to resolve unemployment in a short time frame. On the other hand, one must understand that this was an experiment that led to catastrophe of unprecedented scale. Systems built on rigid control, artificial valuations, and the assumption of perpetual expansion tend toward global collapse. They suppress the natural mechanisms of market self-regulation. They create conditions for apparent prosperity, but actually accumulate imbalances that later explode catastrophically. The history of this economic miracle stands as an instructive tale for anyone studying economics and history. It demonstrates how state power, when concentrated and directed towards specific objectives, can achieve striking results in the short term. But it also illustrates the dangers of such an approach, how an economy built on artificial foundations tends toward exhaustion, how it requires constant expansion to sustain itself, and how ultimately such a system was programmed for catastrophe. What appeared to be a miracle in 1935 proved to be a post-dated check, paid in blood, and massive human loss that exceeded any rational calculation or accounting.